All right. Hello and welcome once again to White Lotus of Light conversational series. I am super excited for this episode because I've already had a bit of a sneak peek on this lecture. Hans Dietrich is here on the show, and he is an esoteric researcher into esoteric knowledge, ancient sites and civilizations, as well as occult symbology. And so I met Hans on my somewhat infamous isn't the right word, but my storied trip to Mexico that I've talked about a lot on this channel. And Hans and I were both there as part of a Templar tour of Mayan sacred sites that was led by Templar Grand Master, the Grand Master of the Templar Collegia, Timothy Hogan. And so Timothy Hogan's been on a million different shows. He has a show with Scott Wolter on Gaia TV. He's been tasked with being an occult and esoteric symbology expert for a variety of movies in Hollywood and so forth. And he's an expert. And Hans actually gave a presentation along with Tim Hogan. And there was a couple of times where I didn't know who Hans was, and Hans would raise his hand and he'd say, well, Tim, slight correction. I was like, who is this guy who's correcting the Templar Grand Master? Like, boy, this guy really thinks highly of his knowledge. I can't believe it. But then I started noticing that Hans would keep just knocking it out of the park, and Tim would go, oh, thank you, Hans, that's correct, blah, blah, over and over. And then Tim said, here, Hans, let's do this presentation. So I saw just a little bit of the presentation we're going to get today. And so we're going to talk over the course of these two episodes over what I call the Atlantean Diaspora. But in order to understand the Atlantean Diaspora, you have to understand where we get the legend of Atlantis through Plato and Solon. So before we leap into it, Hans, do you want to share a little bit about your background beyond what I said?
Yeah, certainly. So I'm Hans Dietrich. I'm a graphic artist and multimedia producer. And excuse me, as you had mentioned, I'm a researcher of esoteric knowledge. I get into ancient sites and civilizations. I've been to all over the world, 22 different countries. I grew up in Kathmandu, Nepal, of all places. And while growing up there, I was able to travel all over Pakistan, Kashmir, Ladakh, India, Bhutan, Burma, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. And so having that kind of a background with travel in my younger years, I've always been around travel, and I've always been very interested in ancient sites, especially around Nepal and India. And so in 2014, I got invited to go to Peru with Brian Forrester, who's the elongated skull expert. And while I was there, I met Stephen Mailer, Patricia Iowan Lehman, and her husband, Yusuf Iowan. And they run tours in Egypt. And so I started getting even more interested in going to Egypt. And so in 2016, I joined them on a tour in Egypt with about 35 other people. And in 2018, I was invited to go back to Egypt to become a manager on the tour because we had 82 people on the tour. And it was really amazing. We also had Andrew Collins, Hugh Newman, and J.J. Ainsworth on the second tour. And so there was a vast sharing of esoteric knowledge, knowledge in general of the ancient sites and the civilizations that we were seeing. And this got me into a lot more research into Kemetology, which is an alternative study of Egyptology that goes back a lot further and deals with more of the Suf people who originally were in both Phoenicia and Kemet back in the day. And so these would have been somewhat of the remnants of what we call Atlantis at that point, all the way up to the point where the Greeks basically invaded and took over Egypt in the 300 BC era. And so, yeah, this is a little bit about my background and my passions. And so doing more research into this, I started discovering that there was a lot of connections between Egypt and a lot of other nations around the world, or ancient Egypt for that matter.
Wow. Okay. Well, so just for viewers that perhaps aren't familiar with this story, the story of Atlantis is passed down to us through Plato. And Plato had a either uncle or he was some kind of relative of the family or friend of the family who was an Athenian statesman named Solon. And Solon claimed that he had gone to Egypt and that there were these priests in Egypt who kept secret knowledge about the fact that there are rises and falls in civilizations and that civilizations tend to end in catastrophes. And they shared the story of Atlantis. And Plato then shares with that in the which of his works? It's not the Republic, it's the Critias, is that right?
It's the Critias, yeah, I believe so.
Yeah, that he shares this story, and in it he's very explicit that this is not a metaphor, this is a historical fact, so says Solon. And so he was very clear about that, and yet modern academics will just routinely dismiss it and say, no, it's about an allegory of a perfect society like in the Republic. And it's like, that's not what he says, though. He's very explicitly says the opposite of that. And I found that academics meet that with a closed wall. And before we started this show, this is going to be segued into a broader historical series that I do with Michael Laflemme, where actually I'll probably do a review of this with Michael, and Michael can flesh out some additional things. We might have Hans back on to go a little deeper. But in this milieu of people who are doing research on alternative history, there's a big problem in that a lot of people who are into alternative history will kind of chase the next shiny object. They'll kind of go after the next sexy theory. And a lot of times they won't do the kind of like scholarly academic research in order to really ground any discoveries in, what we call the loosely agreed upon so-called mainstream history. The thing is that while Hans and I will agree that academics will routinely close doors around subjects like Atlantis and say, no, we're not looking into this, that's not a credible thing. The flip side is that when you have this sloppy, fanciful, kind of like any narrative that sexy will do, kind of alternative history milieu, people then, they throw the baby out with the bathwater and they abandon critical thought and reason altogether. And so what I love about Hans's work is that it is not afraid to go wherever the truth may lie in research around these ancient civilizations. But at the same time, Hans has a pretty rigorous critical thinking background that he applies to this subject, which I think you'll see in this. And so with that in mind, that Atlantis comes down to us through the Greeks, did you want to talk a bit about the difference between chematology and Egyptology, and go ahead and start your presentation, Hans?
Well, I would. Also, what comes down to us about Atlantis is when it supposedly sunk or went under the ocean. And so this is around the time of the Holocene Comet event.
Yes.
And so we were coming out of, difficult times. Half the world was frozen over, which makes a lot of travel very interesting. And there were ancient and somewhat advanced civilizations that came out of this, like what we see at Göbekli Tepe and Karen Tepe. Mm-hmm. And we're told that these civilizations are both, hunter-gatherer civilizations, but they built city structures without planning, without astrology, without mathematics. This doesn't make sense. And so a lot of that then went into Sumerian history, that then went into Phoenician and Kemetian history, basically, as they spread around the Mediterranean area. And so I got into this doing a lot of research into chematology, which kind of is a no-no word in a lot of academics because they're only used to what history was brought down to us by the Greeks. And everything has to fit within a biblical and Greek timeline, which is why, they put the doors up basically, what just happened, but I got really blurry all of a sudden. They put the doors up basically, it's odd.
Yeah.
What just happened? They put the doors up basically so that they don't have to explain things that are beyond this timeline. And up until Göbekli Tepe was discovered, everything had to fit neatly within this timeline. And there's some serious anomalies that you see in Egypt that do not match that. And so let's get into the presentation.
Are you seeking a deeper connection to the divine, along with a personal journey of transformation? Welcome to Angelic Magic Classes. with White Lotus of Light, where the light of the angels guides you through the realms of spirit, the integration of your shadow, healing of trauma, bringing harmony, abundance, and purpose into your life. In our angelic magic classes, you will explore the profound relationship between divine energies and personal growth. By connecting with the celestial angelic realms, you uncover a path to greater happiness, a stronger sense of purpose, and a life filled with abundance of all kinds, from material financial prosperity to an abundance of love and joy in your day-to-day life. Under the guidance of Ian Ferguson and our experienced angelic magic practitioners, you will learn the ancient art of theurgic angelic magic. Explore the metaphysics of magic, the hermetic principles that govern the laws of our universe, sacred rituals, divine invocations, and powerful spells that have been passed down through the ages. Our classes help you align with your higher self, unlocking the key to a more fulfilling life through personal transformation. Discover the divine light within, connect with angelic celestial beings, and navigate and transform the shadows of your internal psyche that hold you back from fulfilling your true divine purpose and mastery of your own life experience. Our course is designed to bring you peace, happiness, and abundance in all areas of your life. Don't miss this opportunity to transform your life with angelic magic and start your journey towards spiritual awakening, personal fulfillment, and a newfound prosperity and joy in your day-to-day life. It is time once again for those who feel the call to pick up the arms and armor of the Most High God and become divine protectors of humanity and join the ranks of the co-creators of this earth realm, that we might bring about a more peaceful, harmonious, and loving planet.
I don't know if that's come up. Yes, it has. Awesome. So my presentation is about Egypt and the land of Kemet, and I call it an alternative history of mysteries. And so the first question is, what is Kemet? And so Kemet comes to us from these Egyptian hieroglyphs. And so the hieroglyphs basically spell out the word Kemt. A lot of the vowels were kept silent because these were expressions of the language that you express through your voice, not so much through a writing style. And Kemet basically means the black fertile land. And how we get that is from what these different hieroglyphs represent. And so the hieroglyph on the left is called the irrigation berm. The owl represents darkness. And this is all found under the dome of the sky, which was known as Nut, Nut and Mut, the Milky Way and the day sky. And the X with the circle around it means the place of. And so this is the place of dark irrigation that exists underneath the sky, basically fertile land. It's interesting because when the Arabs took back over Egypt in the 700s, 600, 700 AD from the Greeks, they went back to the ancient Suf language and called the land Alkemet. And this is where the words alchemy, chemistry, chemical, and chemo come from. They're all part of this alchemical concept coming out of the ancient fertile or black land. And as alchemists, we take the black alluvian land or the prima materia, the distilled water and the fire to create what we call the philosopher's stone of sorts. And so this all comes out of chemistry and alchemy, coming from this ancient idea. And so how do we study this? Well, we study it through chematology. And so chematology is an indigenous wisdom alternative to Egyptology. And it was brought to us through indigenous wisdom keeper Abdel Hakim Irwan. He wested in 2008. I say wested because in the ancient Suf language, they had no word for death. basically, westing was what would happen when the sun would set over the horizon. This is what they felt that your body and your spirit would do when you die or you west, is you would follow the sun over the horizon, separate and become your light form, and then be reborn again or come back again as somebody else. He passed his knowledge down to Stephen Mailer and to his son Yusuf Iwan and to his daughter-in-law Patricia Iwan Lehman, who I learned from. And although I don't specifically agree with everything that I was taught, because there's a lot that Hakim says that Stephen has changed, and then Yusuf also has a background in some of this. And so I've kind of collaborated a lot of that knowledge together into what I'm presenting here. And so chematology is an alternative to Egyptology. So let's discover what Egyptology was. Well, Egyptology comes to us from Jean-François Champollion, who passed away in 1832. And he founded the scientific Egyptology basically after he deciphered, supposedly, the Rosetta Stone. And it's interesting because the Rosetta Stone is incomplete. And so the question is beggared, how much of it could he actually decipher? And as you saw with the word Kemt or Kemet, a lot of the words in the hieroglyphic language aren't just simple words. They're basically icons in a sense, where they're bringing together different words to create an idea or a concept. And so it's difficult to believe that Champollion could have figured all this out from what little he was given with the Rosetta Stone, as we see here on the right. And then Egyptologists basically come along after this, and they study mostly the Greek-inspired history of the land, because when the Greeks conquered in 320 AD or BC, they basically came in and rewrote a lot of the Egyptian or Kemetian history to reflect what they understood with their own Greek history. And so they arrived in ancient Kem, and they went to this city called Memphis, which is not the name of the city. We'll get into this. Memphis is a Greek name for the city. But in Memphis was a stele next to a temple. And on the stele, it read, Het Ka Ptah, and this is in the Suf language. And Het Ka Ptah basically means the enclosure or temple of the body of the creator god Ptah, who is depicted here on the right. And Ka is your physical double. So if you're having an out-of-body experience, you're in your own mind in a sense, but you're looking down at your body laying in the bed or sitting in a chair. That body there is then your physical double, because you're yourself, but you're looking at your physical double. And so this is what basically Het Ka Ptah meant, was the enclosure or temple for the body, or the place where the creator god Ptah manifests. And so the Greeks, through transliteration, they heard this as Het Keptos or Koptos. And it's interesting because this is where the word Coptic comes from, as we know as with the Coptic Christians. And Koptos is basically Ka Ptah, and it means the body or son of the creator. And so this then became Egyptos, which we now know of as Egypt. And it's interesting because we look at the Coptics were around a lot longer before the character of Jesus Christ came around. And so Jesus Christ is also a title. It's not necessarily a name, and it came from Jesus or Yeshua, which meant the body or son of the creator. Jesus, the son of Zeus. Yeshua, right? Same thing. Where Christos is a title meaning the anointed. And so the Coptic Christos were the children of the creator, or the anointed children of the creator. And that's why they were around before Jesus was, or Yeshua for that matter. So let's get into some of the Greek names. So we have all.
Hans, could you move that cursor over to the left? Because it's kind of sometimes the words there.
Sorry. Yep, not a problem.
Go ahead.
I'm looking at two different screens here. So, okay.
No worries. Please.
So the Greeks changed a lot of the initial Kemetian names. And so it's interesting that we have the word Tanis, which came from Janet, which meant the fertile garden oasis, because where Tanis is located is near the Nile Delta, and it was an oasis that was incredibly fertile. And so this is kind of the crossover between what the Greeks changed and what we know of today in our history of ancient Kemet or ancient Egypt. All comes from Greek names. We have Heliopolis. This was originally Un or On, the city of the wise sun. We have Memphis, which was Min Nefer. Min was the god or the Nefer or Neter, an aspect of nature that meant fertility, and Nefer means harmony. And so Min Nefer becomes the fertile harmony. And this is what Memphis was. It was
I
a
love that.
fertile city along the Nile. We have Ramses. Ramses comes from Ra Masu. Ra is a aspect of the sun, and Masu means rebirth. And so Ra Masu is the rebirth of the sun, and it's a title, not the name of a king. We also have Osiris. Well, Osiris came from Wasir, or wiser, and this is where the word wise and wise man and wiser comes from, was Wasir. But the Greeks called him Osiris. And then his consort was Isis. Well, Isis wasn't her name either. It was Aset, which means the water of life. Is As, or Asgat is water, and Aset is the water of life. And so these are kind of the depictions between what the Greeks gave us in our history and what the Egyptologists continually repeat versus the original Commission Suf names for all these different Isses, because you can tell if it's a Greek word or name in the ancient Egyptian sites because there's always Is at the end of it. There's also an interesting Phoenician connection to Mars. So when the Arabs took back over, they named Cairo Al-Kharhira, which means the vanquisher, the warrior, or the city of Mars. And it's interesting because on Earth, all of the lands of the Phoenicians were called Cydonia, and they're all located on or around the 33rd degree parallel. On Mars, once we started sending spacecraft there and taking photos of Mars, we found this area that they called the City of Mars. And it's located at Cydonia on Mars, and it's also at the 33rd degree parallel. And this is where we find the famous face on Mars and the supposed 5- and 4-sided pyramids, but we also find pyramids in this region here on Earth. And so it's interesting that there's this connection between the Cometians, the Phoenicians, and Mars through Arabic traditions. There are other misinterpreted Suf words. Hor means the male aspect of the house, where Hathor means the female aspect of the house. But we're told that Hathor was a goddess or a netter. And so this is kind of a misunderstanding around her name. Then we have Aswan. Aswan is a city in the south of Egypt today, but As means water and Suan means of the south. And so this was the southern waters of the Nile is what Aswan means. We have Asgat Nefer. So Asgat also meant water, and Nefer means harmony. And it was always depicted with this foot, the jug, and then the water pouring on the foot. And then this repeats in a cyclical pattern. And this meant the harmony of water. And so if you see this symbol in places, it means that the water is good, it's safe, you can drink it. This is Asgat Nefer. And we also have the Unas pyramid, which is interesting because this is the only pyramid in ancient Kem or ancient Egypt that actually has hieroglyphic writing on the inside of it. And there's an interesting phenomenon where if you put your flashlight up against the back wall is made out of alabaster, and so it glows this orange. But if you move your flashlight to the wall next to it, it's limestone, and so it has this weird blue glow that comes out of it as well because of all the crystalline mass in the limestone. But Unas means the wise sun that meets the waters, because the Unas pyramid was in front of a lake. And so this is where the waters came to the lake. We then have Amun Ra. So Amun Ra means the power of the hidden sun. And we're often told that Ra or Amun Ra was their word for the sun. Well, these are just two aspects of the sun. And last, we have Horus. Horus represents the rising and setting sun. And we're told that for 80 years, Horus fights his uncle Set or Seth, and this represents the human lifetime of 80 years of sunrise and sunset. And so it's this constant battle between the skies and the stars. And as I like to quote movies often, this is somewhat where we get the concept of Luke Skywalker from, because Luke is a shorthand name for Lucius, which means the sun that walks across the sky. And on the horizon, or Horus, rising, he meets his dark father, Darth Vader, and they battle through the darkness only to be risen again as the sun that Luke needs to become and the light body that Darth Vader or Anakin Skywalker becomes. And so it's interesting to see this play out in ancient Kemetian and Egyptian mythology. This then takes us into the 5 phases of the sun, which is the origin of Kemetian cosmology. And so the first phase of the sun is called Sahra, which means the birth of the sun. And we often depict this or see it depicted as the kefir, or the dung beetle, which is known as the digger. And it would basically ball up a piece of dung, dig into it, and plant its eggs or its larvae in there, and then roll it to the top of the hill when the sun rises in the morning so that it heats, hatches the larva, and they have something to eat. And so Sahra is this process of the birth of the sun. And Kefir is the dung beetle, but is also the scarab. And so you see the scarab depicted all over the Kemetian hieroglyphs. And so Horus, rising, is where we get hours and horizon from. And this is also where the name Sarah comes from, which is a title, the birth of the sun. The second phase of the sun is Ra. And so this is the adolescent or angry sun. And it's depicted with the sun inside of the sun, with the angry rays of the sun coming out. And so Ra is a representation of rays of the sun, but this is also where we get the word Israel from, which means water, sun, and God in the ancient Kemetian language. This then takes us into the third phase of the sun, which is Un, or On, which was the wise sun. And so this is the sun after noon, and this is where we get the word noon from, Un, and afternoon, and to turn something on, like a light switch, on, to turn it on. If you look at a corporate logo, a great example of this is on star. So you're turning the star on, or your satellite link. And so there's a lot of overlap that goes into occult symbology that comes out of a lot of the ancient history of Kemet or Egypt.
Yeah.
So then the fourth phase of the sun was called Aten, and it means the wisest sun or the enlightened sun. And this is where we get the words patience or attention from, comes from Aten. And then lastly, we get into the last phase of the sun, which is Amun. And Amun means the veil of darkness, the hidden, or the westing. And so it's interesting that in Christianity, the prayer Amen, or even in Islam, Amin, comes from this word Amun. And so when we go to prayer to the Most High, we're like, oh, please, hear my prayer, Amen. But in reality, you're basically saying, bury my prayer under a veil of darkness to be hidden, so nobody ever will hear it. And so this is kind of a misconception that comes out of this word. And unfortunately, the Hanuti priests of ancient Kemet were the ones that changed a lot of this after Akhenaten's rules over the land. And Akhenaten is kind of an interesting person, and we'll get into him next. So Akhenaten was known as Amenhotep IV. And so if we break this word down, Hotep is an altar, and Amun means the veil of the hidden. And so basically, Amenhotep means the hidden altar. And so Amenhotep IV didn't want to follow the different neters or the aspects of nature. He wanted to become a monotheist and follow the sun, or the aspect of the sun. And so he changed his name to Akhenaten, which means the light body and key of enlightenment. And so he goes from being the dark, hidden altar to becoming the key of enlightenment through the enlightenment of the sun. And it's interesting because his head of his main mentor that he would travel around with, his name was Paren Nefer. So Ren is the secret name in the 9 souls of the afterlife, and Nefer means harmony. And so Paren Nefer means the harmony of the secret names. And so why was this man's name secret? Well, we'll get into this in a second. And so Akhenaten then named his son Tutankhamun. So this becomes the completed key of the hidden, because the Ankh is the key of life, or the completed life of the hidden. And so Tutankhamun becomes this, completed life or completed key of the hidden in his own name. But then who is Paren Nefer? Well, Paren Nefer was possibly who we know of as Moses. I've often thought that Moses came from the word Tutmosis, but it actually comes from the word Ra-Masu, which meant the rebirth of Ra. And as Moses was considered the second historical monotheist, this would have been his rebirth. And so leaving in the Exodus of Egypt, or ancient Kem, he becomes Ra-Masu, or Moses. And so this is just a brief history of where these names shift over time. And so this then takes us into the 9 souls of the afterlife. or westing. And so when you die or when you west, your body is broken apart into different aspects of your body. And so the first aspect of the body is called Khet, which is the physical body, your physical form. And then Khet breaks apart and becomes Sa, the spiritual body. So these two concepts work hand in hand. Then you have Ren, which is the secret name or the identity of Khet and Sa. So then you have Ba, and so Ba is your personality or your spirit, and it's often depicted as a bird with your head on it. And if you've ever watched the Japanime Spirited Away, the lady that rules the bathhouse at night will turn herself into a bird with her head on it and fly off into the sunset to go westing. And so there's a lot of interesting overlay with iconography and occult symbology in that movie as well. Then you have the Ka, and the Ka is your double or your vital essence. And so these are all the different souls of your body that you shed away as you go through the westing process and you cross the Duat, the sacred river, into the west. Next is Ib, the heart, followed by Shut, the shadow. And then finally, you're left with Sachem, which is the power or energy form, which then becomes Aken, or the light body. And so these are all the different hieroglyphs that represent these different concepts of the 9 souls of your afterlife when you west, or when you follow Amun over the horizon into the western lands or westing lands.
Can I ask?
And so this, yeah, certainly.
So this is fascinating. Is this in any way, and maybe you don't know, is this in any way similar to some of these Vedic concepts of the like different sheaths? You know, like you have your karmic body, you have a causal body, you have that sort of thing. Like, is there any
yes
symbolic?
there
Okay, please, yeah.
There definitely is a symbolic transfer to some of the Vedic scholarship as well. Because when you look at some of the Vedic scholarship and you look at some of even the South American gods and goddesses or netters, they're all very similar.
Yeah.
And so the concepts of, as we saw when we were in near Kobo, when we went to the Mayan village, we were told about the chakras by the shaman, which I thought was fascinating because the ancient Maya have a chakra history as well. So do the Vedas, and so in a sense do the ancient Kemetians through their netters and through how they depict, you know, their own deaths in the different forms within themselves. And so that's interesting that these kind of all overflow. Some of these, we'll call them gods and goddesses, but they're aspects of nature, even look the same in both Mayan and Vedic cultures. There's a great book. Interestingly, we can grab it for the second half. It's somewhere in my office, but it's called The Last Atlantis Book You'll Ever Read. And the author of it basically compares Egypt with Hindi and Vedic scholarship as well as Mayans, and connect them all through very similar languages, very similar gods and goddesses, very similar concepts, and figures that this all came out of a much older culture, which would have been this Atlantean culture, which we don't really know if that's the name of the culture, but we definitely know that that was a time period that this culture existed in. And so it's an Atlantean time period. And so this gets into the 6 houses. I don't know if you wanted to ask me more questions about this, or if we wanted to dive into the different houses, which then take us into the connection between the ancient Kemetians and Egyptians and South America, the Polynesian cultures, Central America, and even North America.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this seems like probably like kind of the natural breaking point. So I'll just ask you a couple follow-up questions, and then we'll just kind of go from there. So I forget. I feel like that shaman, when we were talking about it, I noticed that as well, of course. But didn't he mention that they had a 5 chakra system? Am I remembering that correctly?
I believe so. It was a little different than
right than the classic
the 7, 8 chakras. Correct.
And then, are you saying that could you put that screen up again? That last one we were just looking at.
Yeah, certainly.
Are there links to chakras? I mean, there's 9 of them. So are they including? Because certain new age groups, which usually it's just repackaged esoteric knowledge that they're trying to like just, commodify, right? But some of them show chakras above and below the classic Hindu seven. So is there an overlay between these nine souls of the afterlife and the chakras, or is there no like?
These are more aspects of the body, and so they could be considered chakras to some degree because they are energy points or they're energy systems within our body, kind of like a Russian doll in a sense. So instead of actually having different points representing the chakras, where you go from your base chakra to your crown chakra, this would be more like stacking
I
of
see.
of different elements of the body, and so it's similar, but it's not quite the same.
So then that
And
sounds more like the sheath concept in Hindu,
correct,
right?
correct,
Causal body, the karmic body,
correct.
I forget the other, but there's some like six or seven. I think there's seven sheaths if I remember correctly.
And so it's interesting. It's interesting that a lot of this information came to me initially through William S. Burroughs' work, "The Road to the Western Lands," and this
Ah,
is before I even realized what he was talking about in this book. And
mhm.
so he's talking about the Western lands as in westing, the process of actually going west, crossing the duat, getting rid of all the different layers of your body in order to be accepted into the afterlife or into the next realm. And
Mhm.
so when I was doing research on this over the last year, I realized that there are actually 8 souls of the afterlife in the Egyptian Book of the Dead,
Mm,
but there is a ninth, and the ninth is Aken, which is the light body. And so if all of your souls are shed correctly, all these energies are shed correctly, then you will become the light body. Otherwise, you have to go through the process again. And so this is very similar in even Buddhist concepts of you can go through your life many times polishing your diamond, and eventually you will become the light body or the rainbow body. Or if you reach enlightenment or nirvana, a state of nirvana within your lifetime, then you become bodhisattva and you can stay behind and help others through compassion, through their own karmic suffering. Or you can choose to become your astral light body. And so there's that choice in the Buddhist philosophy as well. But
mhm.
all these concepts seem to overlap quite a lot
Yeah,
between these cultures.
yeah. Then that of course it seems to imply that there is some sort of historical antecedent or transoceanic and or transcontinental migration of these concepts. I mean, it's somewhat been explained away in modernity, I would say, to some degree. Jung was attempting to do that with the collective unconscious, but I feel that
Mm,
that is its own also existent aspect of reality, the 100th monkey syndrome, where like they would
right.
crosswords in Australia, and then they would, without releasing that information, and this was way pre-internet, they would release that same crossword like a week later in England, and people would solve it twice as fast. And so that shows, and there's innumerable examples of this, that there does seem to be some sort of collective unconscious, but you wouldn't expect it to be quite so extensive as seems to be the case with some of these very complicated, very specific concepts, some of which you find transoceanic voyages would be the explanation if it was being passed on directly through communication of some sort in the physical realm. And you have a lot of evidence backing that up. And so if you want to turn off the slideshow just for a second, I think this is a good place to just pause, and then we can segue into the second half, Hans. I'm really,
Certainly.
because the second half, in my opinion, is rubber really hits the road. I mean, Hans did great work explaining all of that, and it's very important, these concepts, because it leads directly into Hans's evidence of extensive transoceanic travel millennia, or a millennia at least, prior to Columbus, which of course then means it's pretty likely that between the ancient Egyptians and Columbus, that maybe you might have had people like the Taínos and the Sinclairs going across the Atlantic,
Right.
which we have quite strong evidence for. And I think there was actually quite a bit of travel with the Templar. We have a lot of information passed down through our Templar lineage that the Templar had been coming over here for a couple of centuries before Columbus. And indeed, Columbus came over with Templar crosses on his sails, but we might get into that in part 2. And so this seems like a great place to stop. And so the next episode will be up about a week or so after this one comes up. But Hans, for you and me, we're filming it all today. So thank you so much for watching. And if you got this far, hit like and subscribe. And Hans, stay tuned, and we will continue after the break.
Thank you for having me on. Awesome.
Yeah, awesome.